Of this covering deprivation. We have, let me just give you the schedule before I introduce someone who really doesn't need much of an introduction. I just have to tell you that today it's from 10 to 1, the classes, 10 to 11:15 Sainath with a 15-minute break, and then 11:30 to 12:45. Tomorrow it's 8:30 to 9:45. And then the day after, it's again 10 to 11:15, 11:30 to 12:45, okay? And then Friday, as you know, is your open book exam. Right. So let me just, as quickly as possible, because I don't want to spend more time between you, waste any more time between, what you have to hear from Sainath, and that's a hell of a lot. Let me just very quickly tell you things that you already know. Just want to tell you that Sainath got, he was awarded the Ramon Magsaysay Award for Journalism, Literature and the Creative Communication Arts in 2007. And he was also the first journalist in the world to win Amnesty International's Global Human Rights Journalism Prize in its inaugural year, and that was 2000. And also with CNN's Jim Clancy, he won the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's prestigious Boerma Prize for work of international importance in addressing the issues of hunger. There are many more awards, several that are listed here, and I'm sure there are many more that I'm not aware of. But I would like to tell you that many of you, I'm sure many of you have read Everyone Loves a Good Drought. The last time I heard it was on its 19th printing. Now, 30th, good grief, in 1 year, 30th printing. There are many, working on Everyone Loves a Good Drought meant cover, it seems like, it's a book, right? What is behind the book? That's important. Meant covering 100,000 kilometers across India. And Sainath has used, 16 forms of transport for this, maybe many more today, and walked over 5,000 kilometers on foot. There's so much hard work, there's so much that has gone into one book. But consider all the writings that Sainath has come out with, that you have been inspired by. Many of you have read those, I'm sure. It's there in many forums. It's there online. So what I'm going to do is just, before I ask Sainath to start addressing you, talking to you, there is just one more thing I want to say, and this is a part of Sainath some of you may not be aware of. This is that he is an ace photographer. And I have seen some of the photographs that he has taken. Fabulous photographs of the country. When I say fabulous, that's probably a misnomer, that's ill-advised. But nevertheless, these are pictures that you need to look at. These are photographs. And he also, in the course of his lectures, he also talks about the cliches that are used both in print journalism as well as in the photographs that so-called, adorn print journalism. So I'm going to leave you with Sainath. We have 5 sessions with him. And as always, we are very honored to have him with us. Thank you for being here, Sainath. And
thank you. Now, thanks, Nandi. I understand we have over the next 3 days, we have 7 hours. You and I together, we have 7 hours. Now, typically, a hell of a lot happens in 7 hours in India, which is very unlikely to be reflected in your media in any meaningful way. And you can decide for yourself whether you consider the events themselves meaningful. They do reflect in the media sometimes, but without any perspective or context or any real juxtaposition. But what are the kind of things that would happen in any 7 hours in this country? In 7 hours in India, typically, these are all averages, of course. In 7 hours, 14 farmers will have committed suicide. 80 to 100 will attempt suicide. 640 will quit agriculture forever. About 1,000 to 1,100 children will die of malnourishment or malnutrition related diseases. And in the same 7 hours, the government of India will write off 400 crores in taxes for the richest Indians. You can ask me how I got those numbers, because they're all available to you as well. It's a way of expressing things. Now, these are not necessarily for writing about. I mean, I write about them because apart from the field reports that I do some opinion pieces as well. But it's good for you to be aware, to know, to have a background in your head, always to have a larger canvas for the work you're doing. Of the many besetting sins of journalism, I'm just touching 3 in this session. One is a lack of context. 2 is a lack of proportion. And 3 is a lack of perspective. There are many besetting sins of journalism, but that's 3 of them that matter just now for our purpose. Now we are all off to the villages soon, I understand. If you have looked in this school at the issues of hunger, deprivation, wage labor, migration, poverty estimates, and if you've looked at these issues with Professor Nagaraj, then you've been very privileged. There is no one better in the field to talk to you about these issues. For more than 2 decades now, whenever I have a struggle with any of these issues, especially the macros, the big numbers, the hard economics, Nagaraj is the guy I trouble. I don't know how many times I phone him during those periods. But I'm not going to trouble myself or you with any of these, with that level of these issues. Because you are going to be doing something different when you're out there as journalists and reporters. This is the information you need, and as I said, you're privileged because you are getting that instruction from someone who is unmatched, in my opinion, in some of those at some of those levels. Beyond that, your task now becomes a different one. It is, as reporters or as journalists, telling the story, expressing. When I came in a minute ago, I told you in 7 hours, 14 farmers will commit suicide, 100 will attempt it, 640 will quit farming. What was that? That was a way of expressing it. It was a way of telling a story that held your interest. Right? It held your interest. So that's how it is. When you're writing reports, you're going to be doing something very different. You're going to be doing, when you're doing journalism, you're going to be telling stories. So you're off to the villages, you're armed with a lot of macro knowledge. You will, hopefully make micro or individual valid observations and work and study in the village. My question to you is, how will you tell the stories? How will you tell the stories, how will you tell the stories so that A, you understand it, B, so that your audiences understand it, and C, so that it makes sense and links to our everyday lives, which can be not necessarily that each time explicitly. They should be suggested there. They should be subtle. I absolutely enjoy it when a reader writes in a letter saying, you wrote about this, but you didn't mention it also happens in Orissa. I know it happens in Orissa. But I'm very glad that the reader made it, because you allow the reader some space for making links, for making connections, for using their own thinking power, rather than lecturing and prosing them about it. So that's making the links. In the villages you go to, the problem is not finding stories. That is the least of your problems. The problem is not finding a story. The problem is realizing when you have found one. Okay? You might sit on it for a month without realizing what a big story you have. The problem is realizing that you have found a story. That's the first of the problems. The second is capturing it for yourself. The third is telling it for others. So now, you're going to give me some ideas on how you're going to tell, in a period of acknowledged rising hunger in the country. Tell me about it. What is hunger? Journalistically, how would you, what are these ways that you'd look at it, express it? What kind of things would you run up with? You can look at hunger in Chennai. You don't have to go to a village for it. In each village, the story, in villages in different parts of the country, the story can be very, very different. I mean, hunger in Tamil Nadu villages will be very different from hunger in Orissa, than in the hunger in the villages of Orissa, for instance. It can be very different. The expressions of it can be very different. The manifestations of it can be very different. Now, telling that story, who are we writing it for? Who are we telling it to? We are telling it to audiences that largely do not experience that hunger. We are telling it to people like ourselves, from our class backgrounds. So your challenge becomes greater. The economist, how many of you have heard of the economist Walter Bagehot? You know which magazine he founded? The Economist. He and his father-in-law founded the journal The Economist. One of the very interesting, by the way, when Walter Bagehot was editor 130, 140 years ago, The Economist was a left-wing radical journal. Okay? It was a very progressive, very pro-poor journal. And one of the most beautiful comments he made was, it's very hard to explain hunger. It is very hard to explain hunger to the rich and the well-off. They cannot understand why, if you are hungry, you don't ring the bell and tell the butler what you want. Now, that was something he wrote in 1870. Nothing much has changed. Maybe it's gotten worse in some ways, because the privileged are larger in number than maybe they were in 1870. So we know that. We know that it's difficult to tell them. We know a lot of other things in the broad canvas. We know that from the 1990s, there was something unique about food production in our country. What is the unique term that takes place from the 90s, which continues to this day, about food production in India? Tell me. Okay, Green Revolution is not 90s, dear. Okay, you're telling me, you're saying stagnation, right? That's correct. But express it for me in a way that captures how much of a change has taken place from earlier. Yes, but I said in food production, for instance. Yes, yes.
It's a new position of food surplus combined with chronic food shortages for the poor.
Yeah, well, the question of the surplus is debatable. You're absolutely right about the food shortages for the poor. From the 1990s, for the first time in your history as an independent nation, the rate of growth of food production is below the rate of growth of population. Does that tell you something? Does that express something? And secondly, consider that the rate of growth of population has been declining and declining significantly. Okay? Your decennial growth rate of population in the 50s, 60s, you're talking about 3.5%. You're talking about 32%, 33% decennial growth rate, or an annual growth rate of 3.4, 3.5%. Now, when population growth rate is much less, almost half to 60% of that, even when it was 3.4%, your rate of growth of food production was higher than your population growth rate. Your population growth rate has declined, but your food production growth rate is lagging behind population growth rate if you take 5-year or 10-year periods, not a 1 year. A 1-year one-off thing doesn't tell you much. You've got to look at it in 5-year blocks or 3-year blocks or 10-year blocks or whatever you like. So that is, we know this. We know that food production, growth rate of food production is lagging behind the growth rate of population. Do you get a sense of how serious the situation is? When your food production growth rate, when your population is growing at a faster rate than your food production. Now the second thing is, it wasn't always that way. Even when your population growth rate was higher, your food production was outpacing it. So something very, very significant has happened. And as reporters and as journalists, you are trying to capture how that has impacted, how that has manifested itself in the poor people of this country, as he says, who face acute food shortages. So what are the angles you could look at? What are the things that you could think of? There are many things we know on the large canvas. We know, for instance, speaking of your question of your point about food scarcities for the poor, we know from our own Government of India National Family Health Survey that 46% of Indian children are malnourished. As I said, in the 7 hours of our interaction, 1,000 to 1,100 children will have died of malnourishment or malnutrition related diseases in this country. But what you also should know in your large canvas, this 46% rate of malnutrition is what? It's the highest in the planet. It is a damn sight higher, a damn sight worse than sub-Saharan Africa. If you take the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, their average rate of child malnourishment below the age of 5 is 30%. Okay? Ethiopia's is 34 or 35%. Some of the other countries are better. When you bunch them together, they come to an average of 30%. India's is 46%. Now here's another thing that you need to consider. You have no right to have 46% malnourishment. Why? Why do you not have a right to have 46%? I grant that, but then, I'm saying there could be situations in which you have no control over it, where you have no, where you do not have the resources or the means to deal with it. But the question here is, all these sub-Saharan African countries, they don't have your growth rate. They don't have 9% growth rate. They are not nuclear powers. They don't have the second fastest growing economy in the world. They do not have the fourth largest number of billionaires in the world, which we do. They are not software superpowers or IT superpowers. None of them has had 9% growth rate for 10 years in a row. But they've all reduced their child malnourishment much better than you have. That raises questions as a society and as a nation. Does it or does it not? If with all this you can't do it, but people can do much better on much less, then it raises questions about the nature of your growth. Whether that growth has any meaning in terms of translating into better lives for your citizens, or whether the growth has an entirely different character. One of the things about these 7 hours is that you can interrupt when you like. When I walk into class, you can start with a question, So you want to start here, you can start here, otherwise we continue, because you're going to tell me what is hunger. See, hunger is an issue that in a period of rising hunger gives you it has its own peg, it has its own topicality, it has its own urgency. Also, the work you've done and the field experience you will have will give you some degree of perspective. So tell me the story. What is hunger? How do you find it? How do you look at it? You might find it in, now Tamil Nadu for instance has a much better record on some issues, some aspects of this issue than many other states. But you can find it in a lot of ways, in a lot of places all across the country, wherever you're coming from and wherever you're going to visit it. So I'm waiting for you. Tell me the story. There are many stories that also require telling and retelling over generations. Like hunger is not a new story. It's not breaking news. How do you tell that story? What are the ways that you could find or think of expressing it differently? Or, for instance, can we look at migrations as an expression of hunger? Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
So actually it's a pervasive day-to-day phenomenon, and you said that it gets underreported or not reported at all.
Correct.
In fact, I have seen several times in my own newspaper, local newspapers from Allahabad.
Hmm.
There were instances in which they write 3 lines. That a woman was found on the railway track with her kid, and she was extremely poor, and then they say that when postmortem occurred, there was nothing, not even a grain of food in
In a stomach.
It shows it all. I think that's the hunger.
Yeah. Migrations are very much driven depending on who you are and which class of society you belong to. The largest number of migrants are first and foremost driven by the need for food. There's a big difference between the desire for food and the need for food. Now me, I'm always hungry. Okay, but that's not hunger in the sense we're discussing. But you're absolutely right, migrations are spurred by the need for food. Food is the driving force. Why do 3 million Odias move into extraordinary journeys across the country, or a couple of million people from Bihar move into extraordinary journeys right across the country from deep east to deep west in migrations, but for a search for work and payment that will get them food, which sustenance is otherwise absent. Yes, you want to add something? Yeah, you can. But I want others also to start telling me. Now there's one expression. A post-mortem that shows you nothing. That's an expression of a story. Yeah, you want to add?
More than that, more than the migration, there are tens of millions living across the city, across Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Koraput, Malkangiri and all these districts, where people reside in the villages. They are not migrating because perhaps they don't have the energy and the capacity to migrate even. And yet they are on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, I fully.
Ma is the rice, water, not even rice.
Yep.
Whatever water is left after fermenting the rice,
Yeah.
and they drink, and in the case they give the seed of mango, mangoes.
You're quite right. I'm very familiar with the process. I spend a lot of time in those areas each year. But I'm saying, I just threw up a question. Is migrations one form of looking at it? Because I want you to find ways of expressing it. Now the mango kernel, if you go to many of the villages of Bolangir, or even up all the way up from western Orissa right up to southern Orissa, you will find the village has all its mango kernels laid out across thousands and thousands of square feet. They're going to live on those mango kernels. They live first on the mango and then on the kernel. So every little thing of that is put to use in assuaging hunger. That's a way of expressing it. But I want more and more expressions of it. I can think of ways in urban peripheries that you can take of it. But yeah, that's a very valid, that's the kind of thing that I'm asking you to tell me about. What will be your stories? Let a few others also get in on it. Okay, but I'm saying something more concrete. Now there he's talking to you about, he's telling you, post-mortem done shows nothing in the stomach of the person. He is being very specific in his story. He is saying these people who live for a whole season on little more than mango kernels and raw mangoes, and on ganji rice. Now, in the areas that he is talking about, say if you're talking about the regions of Orissa, the average working adult, the average working adult requires 750 grams of uncooked rice daily, because their entire diet is, even the breakfast, pakol, is around rice. They are rice eaters. Which means that a family of five requires a minimum of, after minusing for children, 3 kilograms of rice. Right? And what does your BPL card give you? Per month it gives you something, whereas you're talking about 5 people per day. Per day. So there you have a concrete expression. Yeah, obviously child labor is linked to somebody's hunger. But he's giving you concrete examples, a concrete form of expression. And also, so migrations are, also linked to a lot of other things. Part of the challenge of developing a perspective, is making linkages in your own head, even if they don't necessarily explicitly come out in a particular story, because the story may not be about that, but you need to know about it. For instance, if I say the collapse of Wall Street in 2008 September destroyed the districts of Ganjam and Koraput, how would you find an expression of that? Yeah, please. Microfinance is actually a very, very tiny part of the lives of people in agriculture, for instance. Microfinance has zero role. Microfinance, we'll discuss microfinance very specifically. Okay, but in terms, say for instance, what is the average microfinance loan? Which state are you from? Okay, what is the size of the average microfinance loan in Bengal? 6,000 to 9,000 rupees is the Bengal average, I think. When I last looked, maybe a little more now, but 6,000 to 9,000 rupees would be the average. I do not know the current average for Tamil Nadu. Okay, but what is the average, what is the cheapest acre of land you can buy in Bengal? Cultivable land. 1 lakh per acre. So what will you do on a 9,000 rupee loan? Everybody in a village can't sell eggs to everybody else in the village. Yeah, I'm saying the collapse of rural is something gigantic compared to the collapse of microfinance. Microfinance has in fact aided the collapse in many ways. Yeah. So, but I was saying, how do I make these linkages? One of the things about doing stories on migrants? What are one of the essential things about doing stories on migrants? But I want more of you to speak. I'm not, I'm getting good answers, but I need more of you. Yes. Yeah, but we are looking at the largest crimes committed in Indian history, and they're not linked to hunger, they're linked to greed. Right? They're linked to greed. Now, neither Mr. Mukesh Ambani nor Tata is seriously a victim of hunger. Profit hunger, yes. Right? But not in terms of hunger. So,
unemployment
mass layoffs and unemployment are very closely linked to hunger. Yes.
Sir, I've seen in Orissa, a lot of very educated people who don't get jobs, they end up being auto rickshaw drivers, they sell stuff. It's because they want to sustain their families.
You will find a lot of people in Orissa with a BA degree showing up at the NREGA work site. Yeah. Are you from Orissa?
I was there for a lot of time.
Okay, let me give you that example so that we don't miss out on it. Now, in the last 20 years, you've structured your economy in a particular way. Look at what migrations do, for instance. Ganjam, the district, anyone from, how many people from Orissa and who are familiar with Ganjam? Yeah. Ganjam produces some of the most hardworking, most disciplined labor force in the country. So they are very prized labor for labor contractors. Labor contractors love workers from Ganjam and Bolangir. You can work them like slaves. You can keep them ununionized, and you can really... Ganjam workers can be found in Burma. You can find them in Ladakh. Ganjam turns out a lot of plumbers. You will find Ganjam workers all over Tamil Nadu and Kerala. You'll find them in any part of the country. Now Ganjam, ever since you structured your economy in a particular way, started sending 1 million people each year who go and come back, or some of them stay there, to Gujarat. Where is Orissa? Deep East. Gujarat, right in the west. There is a railway train, the Cuttack, which moves from Berhampur actually, Berhampur to Surat. 95% of whose traffic and revenue is based on the migrant labor. It's one of the highest profit-making sectors of the railways. Because the only people who travel on it are migrant laborers. Now, who are these migrant laborers? Why do they go to Surat? Because Surat, under the globalization expansion, has millions of units producing textiles for export. If I confuse you, stop me and say we don't follow. Yeah? I'm coming to that. But the Odia workers don't account for more than 5% of the diamond polishing units. They don't. They mostly go into the textile units. Sorry? Those are very small numbers compared, and along shipyard, see, the diamond industry has a lot of Gujaratis themselves. It has a high proportion of Gujarati labor itself because it's a better paying sector. The diamond industry also is in the doldrums, but that accounts for 5% of the workforce. Now, 4 lakh workers from Odisha, from Ganjam, from the single district of Ganjam, go just to the power looms of Surat. I said there is one requirement for doing stories on migrants, and one of the first requirement is to be a migrant. You travel with them. You go with them. Otherwise, how do you know what they're doing, where they're going, when they have their food, what do they eat for food, where do they get their food, where do they get their water? How do you know all this unless you do it? So you have 500,000 people from Ganjam in Surat, but over 400,000 of them are just in the power looms. It's an amazing sight. These karkhanas are in the open. Okay? They're just little sheds. You will have 1 kilometer of open sheds with power looms, guaranteed to drive you deaf in half an hour's work, because they're all going on together. Do you know what are the working conditions of these migrants? Imagine how bad things are in Ganjam, that they have to go and do this work, because there's no employment in Ganjam. So they move to Gujarat. 400,000, 500,000 move each year from Ganjam to Surat and come back. They're going there, they're doing their work, there's a constant flow of labor. I go back, my brother comes in. It happens in the state also, a kind of relay. If you go and look at the people on the borders who are going to Tirupati and back, you'll see something like this. across the border into Andhra Pradesh. However, 4 lakh workers working at the power looms. What are the working conditions? Now, typically, one worker handles one loom. Now, typically, one worker handles 4 looms. Why did this? Now, what happened? What happened that in Wall Street that completely destroyed Ganjam? When Wall Street tanked, all the orders for export units collapsed. When the export units collapsed, they sacked 50,000 to 1 lakh workers overnight. Now when I know this, for me, I have several questions in my head. When 50,000 people to 1 lakh people come back to a district, man, there's going to be chaos in that district, right? What kind of chaos can you have if 50,000 people suddenly come back to a district? They've got settlement. They've got places. Typically a farm in this country, understand this, typically a farm in this country, in most parts of the country, runs on the following basis. Mostly it runs on the following basis. One brother stays on the farm. 2, 3 brothers go out and work. One might, the fortunate and more educated ones might work as bank employees, low-level bank employees or insurance employees somewhere. The less fortunate ones, one will work as a primary school teacher nearby, maybe in the next district, or maybe in a city. One might work as a chaprasi in the collector's office. Okay. Now all these brothers send remittances back to the farm. In return for which, after the harvest, they get their share of the produce. Do you understand what I'm saying, or am I confusing you? I don't see any, I'm not confusing you, right? So, I will. So they are sending some money to the big brother, and he is at harvest time giving them their share of the rice, their share of wheat, or their share of whatever is the farm is producing. And that's how the farm sustains itself, because agriculture has become so unproductive. It's become so unproductive, so unsustaining for those who do our agriculture. Now, all these brothers and family have gone from Ganjam to Surat to work in the power looms. 50,000 of them are laid off in 1 quarter. They come back. Now they come back to the ancestral home. Now what happens? Property struggles. Now there are 4 brothers sitting in that house. Each has his own idea of how the land should be utilized. Each thinks that, he knows. Each starts getting insecure because they've just lost their jobs. They start getting insecure about big brother cornering the whole farm, which is not the case. There your crime rate goes up, your hunger goes up. Now, they come back at a time when the NREGA collapses because it cannot cope with suddenly 1 lakh new people coming into the district. Ganjam district, in fact, had a fairly good record. It was a prize-winning district in Orissa for NREG work. But it simply collapsed under the return of so many people. Now, yet another factor you have to consider. They live, by the way, these 4 lakh people live in 93 slums in Surat. The conditions of work are, each of them, they used to handle 2 looms when they started, now they handle 4 looms because the Maliks have laid off lakhs of workers. Now when you're handling 4 looms, do you know what your condition of work is? 12 hours, no break, no chai. Now, you can have your lunch, you can have your tea, but your machine cannot stop working for 1 minute. So what do they, how do I do that? I've got one guy working on this side of me, one guy working on this side of me. If I want my 1 hour break, that is 20 minutes for chai, 40 minutes for lunch. Chai once in the day, lunch or dinner, whichever the shift is. How do I do it? When I take my break, the guy on either side of me handles two of my machines. Understand? Clear? So what does it mean? It means that there is 1 hour. When I come back, then the next guy goes for his lunch and we look after that. It means that there is 1 hour in the day when each worker is handling 6 looms. Is that a story? There. I can take my lunch, I can take 3 hours, so long as someone else does the work. So they all evolve ways of promising each other so many hours of duty. 12 hours, no breaks, you can have your chai, but you can't stop the machine. You can have your lunch, you can't stop the machine. For this, they get between 180 to 250 rupees. Right? Which fell back to the 180 level once the Wall Street tanked. Wall Street tanks, export orders collapse or are withdrawn. Existing orders are withdrawn. The Surat powerloom industry collapses. It lays off lakhs of workers. 50,000 workers go back to a single district called Ganjam. So there you are. Deep interior rural villages of Ganjam are completely wrecked by somebody playing the share bazaar a bit too much in Wall Street. We are all in it together. You get the linkage? So now tell me more about hunger stories. We talked about migration just now, but you're going to go to villages where there will be migrants. One of the very interesting and challenging stories to do is the migrant at home. Because you can't see what he or she has experienced. You're building up a portrait from interviewing them at home. So that's another thing. But I still want to know other expressions of hunger, stories that you can think of, and I want it from, yes. Yeah, there's a whole series of factors linked to the sex trade and to sex work. Okay, hunger may have been somewhere along the chain, but there's a whole confluence of factors. Debt is a very, very, very major driving force in that. In the slums of, in the brothels of Kamatipura in Mumbai, there are 14-year-old girls who are forced to do sex work, okay, prostitution, because their grandfather or their great-grandfather took a 10 rupee loan during a drought in Kalahandi in 1970. So debt has a very, very major form of creating, and that's an expression of one form of bondage, debt bondage, sex trade. There are many things that go into it. Right now, just for a moment or for a little while, tell me about hunger. What are the things you can look at? What are... Yeah. Yeah, I heard you. I'm trying to fit it in. I'm saying, again, that's an outcome of deprivation. It's an outcome of larger deprivation. And yes, hunger is very much a part of larger deprivation. It's a cause of that. I'm asking, you see, you're not... but when you're doing that story, the focus is on the organ trade. Right? And you're looking at one of the causes in the chain. I'm asking you to express find ways of expressing as stories that hunger. Children? Exactly. That's a very powerful way of expressing it. You know, last time I was in Telangana in the summer, each time I'm in the summer in one of these places, you know what is hunger? Hunger is all the women of that village, the mothers, agitating, stopping you in a group of 20, 30, imagining that I have some influence with government, totally wrongly. But journalists like to imagine they are very powerful with government, as you are finding out. But actually they are not. The media bosses are powerful. What do these women demand? Now this is in the middle of summer. there is a heat stroke, there is a heat wave, children are dying of heat stroke, the government of Andhra Pradesh closed the schools 15 days early. They closed the schools 15 days early because of the heat wave conditions being unbearable. What were the mothers demanding? Reopen the schools. Now, they are willing to risk the child's death by heat stroke rather than watch the child die by hunger. But then that's not all. Let's come back to this theme of midday meal. In the urban periphery of Mumbai, I'm accosted by teachers in a municipal school. Okay? What are the teachers saying? And this you will find echoed in many places, in many, many places. For me, it's one of the most powerful things that I came across. The teachers are telling me, when you write about this midday meal, please make one demand. Monday midday meal should be double ration. The midday meal on Monday should be double ration because the child has starved for the preceding 3 days. The last meal that child had was Friday's midday meal. From noon of Friday to noon of Monday, that child has starved at home because there is nothing at home. Okay? Do you know what the teachers tell you? What the teachers tell me anyway, and I retell the story 5 times because I think it's important enough to be told 1,000 times if you can make it stick. The teachers, they say, no teacher is willing to take a class before 1 p.m. on Monday because the children are uncontrollable. Their bellies are burning. They say no teacher attempts to take a class seriously till 1 p.m. because after 12 noon, when they've been fed, you can teach to those children. You can't teach them when they have not eaten, when they've eaten almost nothing for 72 hours. Is that a powerful look at hunger? Think. What others do you have? That's a great point. Yeah, the midday meal. What are the others? Rice? Yeah. We can associate, as I said, the biggest crimes in the country now are not committed by hungry people. Yeah, but yeah.
So, districts of UP, people are eating silica laced mud to survive. That's what I'm saying.
Eating?
Eating silica laced mud.
Yeah, well, I've heard those stories myself, but as I said, something far more concretely laid out, like the mango kernel, that makes a good story. You can make a good visual for the story. You can tell that story systematically, and it covers very, very large groups of people. Yeah, but still, if there is such a thing, one can do it. Yes. Yeah, but begging is much more. Beggary as an institution is much more an urban or semi-urban phenomenon than a rural phenomenon. Much more so. You do not find the large institution of beggary in the countryside that you do in a city. Sorry? Any context you like. I was mentioning, what I was talking about was, the most recent example I gave was urban, but you'll find it, obviously you're going to find it more in some rural areas, but yes.
So food grains are getting rotten in the storage of it because of the ineffective
Storage.
distribution system.
Yeah.
On the part of government.
Yeah. That is a metaphor, that is an analogy that people do use. It is a very valid one.
Even the Prime Minister has acknowledged that it is not possible for even the government to give in India below 2 rupees per kg, even though the people have not got the power.
Because that also raises other stories, doesn't it? It's when we lose so much of our food grain due to storage, and that's a very valid. The example you're giving is a very valid one. It's one that I frequently use, but it raises the other story of, if so much food is lost due to storage, how come the government of India has not built 1 square foot of storage space in the last 7 years. It's privatized that. It doesn't want to do it. So yes, rotting food grain is a powerful metaphor. What about the NREGA sites? If you visit the NREGA sites at the height of summer, you will find people in their 70s coming back to work because they can't afford food. I'm not joking. We've documented multiple cases of people in their 70s coming. You will see a long line of older women standing there. Who are those older women who will be standing there hoping to get work on NREGA? Typically, who would they be? Widows. That's right. Exactly. Why widow? Why would widows turn up there? One. They are still staying with their daughters and sons. What happens is, whether you're a widow or a very elderly male, when there's a food crunch at home called hunger, these are the first to get marginalized within the house, because it is seen, however cruelly, as unproductive people. Okay? Unproductive. Therefore, the widow, the elderly widow particularly, and the elderly male get marginalized in that order. They are not, their share of a shrinking cake becomes even more tiny. But it means that the cake is shrinking. It means that the cake is shrinking, that their share is becoming even more tiny. Now, why do they stand there in a single line at the NREGA begging for work which they are not getting? Why do they not get that work so easily? Yes? No. I'm saying they stand in that queue because NREGA's design is based on your coming in a group. Okay? Try understanding your society from these examples. As I said, one of the things about the story is that what it tells you before you tell readers. A widow in a village is a stranger in her husband's village. Okay? Her own village is where her mother and father are. So she does not have what in Andhra you call the gumpa, the group. So when you go without a group, you go as an individual, the NREGA site official will not give you work. He will say, how much work can you do? How much can you dig? So he turns her away. So at many of the sites in the peak of summer, you'll find long lines of older women begging that guy for some work to do. He's saying, so they form groups themselves. But he says, you're in no fit condition to do this work. So I can't give you the work. And besides, you've not come in a big group. There must be so many males in your group so that, some people do the digging, some people do the passing of the pot, or passing of the brick, or passing of the mud, or whatever. Right? So I'm saying that when you're looking at the stories and the expressions of stories, what were the 3 things I said? One, the story has to make you understand something before you make others understand it. One of the things that the stories you do have to make you understand is more and more about your society. So look, through the NREGA, we're looking at what is the plight of older people. We are looking at the marginalization of the widow or the older woman within the Indian household. As I said, different villages, different regions, different stories. Do you know how Adivasis, tribal people, how do they handle this kind of situation? Now you bring the NREGA. The measurement of work in NREGA is so difficult that nobody gets that 100 rupees. A woman very rarely gets more than 60 rupees because you're going to measure at the end of the day how much work she's done. You set the target for 100 rupees so high that no human being can achieve it. Now, by the way, how do I know this? Because every year I do a couple of days work on the NREGA, voluntarily. And about 5 years ago when it all started, the Journalists Union of Kurnool asked me very excitedly, knowing that I was coming to the district, sir, do a workshop on food for work. In those days, the word NREGA had not yet been coined. So they were insisting that I do a workshop on food for work. So I said, absolutely, let's go. So everybody piled into one van, some 17, 18 of us. And those days, 3 megapixel digitals were a big thing. Okay, 2004 or 5. The 5 megapixel had just come in. Everybody had their smart 3 megapixel and 1 or 2 had 5 megapixel digitals and tape recorders and cameras, and we all marched off to the work site where a lot, this is another thing that you will see, a lot of very underage girls wearing saris and trying to look older than 14 are working on the NREG. There your child labor tells you something. Okay? Why do you find so many girls trying to pretend to be older than they are? Because within the household, as the food shrinks, widow, older male, girl. When the cake shrinks, sorry, the girl gets it. First kick to the girl. Okay? The last is to the male child. The male child is the holy cow. So, the girls are really starved. Now when they go there, they are not eligible to work because they are below the age of 14. So you have 12 and 13-year-old girls wearing big saris and trying to look older than they are in order to be able to work in 47 degrees heat with crowbars to dig 90 cubic feet, which you and I and 5 of us together cannot do in that time.
But they come with or without the consent of the families.
They are coming. The families need them to do that work. The families need those girls to do that work. So what happened with all our journalists, 18 journalists? Some of them are, at least 3 of them were over 6 feet tall and very, very hefty guys and all that. So I said, after we got down, it was exactly 47 degrees, which by Kurnool standards in summer was a pleasant afternoon. Then I said, okay, now everybody keep your cameras and your notebooks in the van. So everyone was mystified. So they kept, but somehow, somewhere they had this silly notion that I knew what I was doing. So we got out and I stopped the girls from working. We stopped these girls from working. And I said, we took all their crowbars and handed it to the journalists and said, workshop begins. Dig. Will you guys try it? Will you guys try this? If you try it, you will never write a story on hunger the same way after you've tried it than before you tried. You will never write a story on labor and deprivation the same way after you have experienced it than before you. What happened to those 18 journalists? In the first half an hour, 3 threw up. The girls stood by first 10 minutes very amused. Next 10 minutes getting bored. Next 10 minutes getting fed up. And next 10 minutes panic because they were getting anxious. Their work was getting screwed up because of all these clowns fooling around there. Then 2 had sunstroke. And believe me, the smokers and drinkers had a bad time. And then, after about a couple of hours of this, and getting roughly 90 cubic inches dug between the lot, we handed the crowbars back to the girls, who then just dug, as if they were born to it, which they were. Right? So there you have many. 2 years ago, it became a very big thing in Andhra Pradesh. I don't know whether whether I should be happy about it or sad about it. At least for the guy, I should be sad. We did a story of a 74-year-old man. His name is Gadasu Ramalu, Nalagonda district, coming to do work on the NREG site. It's about 48, 49 degrees. He's 74 years old. He needs that crowbar to keep himself steady, and he's trying to work because he's hungry. Why? Because 2007 to 2010, we've had the highest price rise in our history since 1973. Now, what is Gadusu Ramalu's pension, old age pension? After Rajshekar Reddy tripled the old age pension of Andhra Pradesh, it became 200 rupees a month. Okay? Now, if your old age pension is 200 rupees a month and tuar dal is 104 rupees a kilo, what will you eat? Togaram parpu, sambar parpu, depending on which part of the country you're from, or tuar dal. Okay, it was 104 rupees in 2009, it reached 104 rupees a kilogram. Now, if your pension, monthly pension is 200 rupees, and 1 kilogram of a staple like that is 104 rupees, what will you eat? Now, do you understand why 74-year-old guys come out to work? Then, all of us fell on him like a flock of whatever. One of our local journalists there very knowledgeably said, Ramalu sir, you're saying you want work on NREGA, you desperately want work on NREGA, but I see that you have worked 3 days, then you have not worked 5 days, then you have worked 2 days, then you have not worked 4 days. The guy looked at us as if we were such blithering idiots, which we were. He said, sir, man like me, I work 3 days, I need 4 days rest. Complete silence. He said, if I work 3 days, I need 4 days rest. I'm 74 years old. He has worked since he was 11. Okay? He's done physical labor since he was 11. That means more than 60 years of his life he has done that work, and he's reached such a stage, his body has reached such a stage. By the way, he's all muscle. There's no flesh. Look at the stories you have on hunger in this country. So that is Ramalu. Find out something by doing it. Be a migrant. Follow the migrant. Interview the migrant at home, that's very good. It's a challenging story in itself. But being a migrant means doing it with the migrant. Traveling with the migrations. Want to find out what NREGA is? Dig. Get yourself into that situation to try and understand, because you're trying to tell stories to people who do not experience hunger, and that includes you and me. That includes you and me. For us to tell an audience what is hunger, which does not experience hunger, if we don't experience anything ourselves, our stories will be that much poorer. Do you agree? There are many, many manifestations of this kind of hunger, but you've got your 15-minute break now, then we'll continue with that.